Hi, I am doing a screencast for my 21st Century Instructional Practices Touchstone. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Leslie Creeth. I am currently a 7th grade science teacher in St. Louis, Missouri. So the example I will be using for my Touchstone is a hyperdoc I have created to introduce the space unit to my 7th graders. Now, first of all, what is a hyperdoc? A hyperdoc is more than just a Google Doc with links. It is an innovative and inquiry-based method of delivering instruction. So it's not just substitution. It's not a digital version of a worksheet. It's not simply a web quest. So let me show you quickly my example. And I'll kind of be going back and forth, referring to the hyperdoc as well as the notes and diagrams that I've created. Just give this a second to load. And I will also share this link as part of my Touchstone. For this hyperdoc, I have used the 5E lesson model. So engage, explore, explain, extend, and evaluate. Sorry about that. So subcompetency 1 is basically describing the components of TPAC, Marzano, and Schulman frameworks. So Charlotte Danielson said that teaching is extraordinarily complex work. Because of this, we must embrace and apply research and strategies that will best improve the quality of instruction and the learning of our students. The work that Marzano and Schulman have done has been exceptional in improving the quality of instruction. So looking at TPAC, it's made up of 6 different components, which you can see here, and I'll be talking about each one in detail. So the first one is content knowledge. This is a deep understanding of information that will be learned or taught. It is not a simple understanding of the content, but a deep understanding that can make connections between different parts of the content. As Schulman noted, this knowledge would include knowledge of concepts, theories, ideas, organizational frameworks, knowledge of evidence and proof, as well as established practices and approaches toward developing such knowledge. So for my example, the content knowledge would be, for 7th grade science, would relate back to the NGSS standards, which are our space goals. And in order for me to teach these things, I need to be as much of an expert as I can. For my lesson, these are shown in the specific standards from the Next Generation Science Standards and from the ISTE standards, which incorporate instructional technology. For my lesson, my students need to be able to know the specific content and skills. So if we go back to the hyperdoc, you can see that I have my standards right here. So the NGSS standards. I won't read all of these. Again, you will have access to my hyperdoc, but basically they are encapsulating these standards as well as the learning goals, which I will talk about later. So the next component is pedagogical knowledge. According to Sonia Guerrero, Pedagogical knowledge refers to specialized knowledge of teachers for creating effective teaching and learning environments for all students. Basically, it's knowing and understanding the different and best ways students learn. This is where we might see Marzano's 9 high-yield instructional strategies. So we might see things like Venn diagrams or note-taking with using the Cornell notes, which I've been using for over 10 years. I taught in an Avid school, and with the Avid program, they use Cornell notes. So as important as content knowledge is, I would argue that pedagogical knowledge is as, if not more important than content knowledge, simply because classrooms are becoming more student focused and the teacher is no longer the quote holder of the information. And I'll talk more about that later. So in my intro to space lessons, students will use a graphic organizer to understand the connection between the key terms. And here we see that graphic organizer. So the students will click and drag these words over on top of the definition. And when they are done, they will, sorry, this one's going to go over here. And when they are done, they're going to be able to see how each of these terms relates to the other. So it's a really great visual for kids to understand these concepts. The next component is technological knowledge. So I present workshops regionally and at national conferences. And one thing that I have said is that technology is not the goal, but learning is the goal. But with that said, teachers in the 21st century must be implementing technology into their curriculum in order for students to be prepared for their future. In addition to this, technology can provide opportunities for choice and voice among students. It also provides opportunities for collaboration that weren't provided 20 or 25 years ago. It is necessary for teachers to be effective at training students for the future. And in order to do this, they must have a basic knowledge of how technology works. Just like logging in or opening a program, they also need to have knowledge of instructional technology tools and how to use them. Google for Education is being used by millions of teachers and is becoming the standard in instructional technology in classrooms today. Teachers need a basic knowledge of how certain Google apps work, like Drive, Gmail, Docs, Slides, and Forms. So in my lesson, like I've showed, I'm using a HyperDoc, and it is created within Google Docs. That'll be shared over Google Classroom. I'm also using Padlet and ThingLink. My knowledge of technology allows me to choose the best tool for learning, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So when we start to see these separate areas combined, we can see how important they are together. In technological content knowledge, we are looking at technology and how technology and content have influenced each other. For example, technology has made conducting research much more efficient. I can think back to when I used card catalogs and when I went to the county library to use the microfiche machine. But with the internet and search engines, I can literally have millions of information available to me in seconds. In the sciences, technology has allowed information to be discovered, as well as made it available to millions of scientists around the world. Computers can compute and analyze an incredible amount of data that no human ever could. This understanding of how content and technology relate is crucial for success in the 21st century classroom. As Kohler put it, teachers need to understand which specific technologies are best suited for addressing the subject matter, learning in their domains, and how content dictates or perhaps even changes the technology. So in my lesson, students will be using things like YouTube for research, online encyclopedias. They'll be also using Padlet in which to display their knowledge. So when we continue to look at the TPAC model, we can combine the pedagogical and content knowledge, which is an understanding of how teaching strategies can complement the subject matter, or in other words, how teaching affects learning. When we think about PCK, we should think, what strategy should I use to best teach this information? Should I use graphic organizers? Should I use close reading? Should I have students make a visual representation? An effective teacher weighs the content and the instructional strategy so her students will learn best. In my lesson, I chose to use a hyperdoc as the vehicle in which the material is represented. This allows for individualized learning, voice, and choice. So in my lesson, I have students use Edpuzzle as part of exploring the information. So I chose this video to correct some misconceptions about the sizes of planets and stars. I have students that think that the moon is bigger than the sun because when they look up in the sky, they see the moon as physically bigger than the sun is. So in order to address that misconception, I use this video in which I embedded questions along the way. Another resource that I use is kind of like a mind mapping resource. So it's called VisuWords, and it allows students to have a better understanding of the key terms. And so when they see how some of the key terms are connected, I think it helps them make connections in their mind. So the next component, as we're bringing together components, the next step is the technological pedagogical knowledge. And as I mentioned before, learning is the goal, not technology. However, technology can vastly enhance learning. By having a good pedagogical knowledge along with a good knowledge of instructional technology, teachers can help students learn in ways they haven't been able to learn before. As Kohler states, this includes knowing the pedagogical affordances and constraints of a range of technological tools as they relate to disciplinary and developmentally appropriate pedagogical designs and strategies. In my lesson, I use instructional technology tools almost exclusively. I use a graphic organizer to help students best understand the relationship between key terms. Students are being given immediate feedback with the Edpuzzle videos, and students can categorize the key terms with the digital organizer that I showed before. With my example, it is very hard to take apart the components such as just technology, just content, or just pedagogy. And because they are so intertwined, again, it's very hard to see some of these things individually without seeing something else affecting it. So that leads me to the TPAC model. And as I appreciated the Venn diagrams that I've seen online, but this is a diagram that I created myself, and I think it helps me understand the TPAC model a little bit better. So we see that there's technology, there's content, and there's pedagogy. And then we see along each of the sides of the triangle those connections and how they each come together to make TPAC. And I believe that you can see throughout my hyperdoc how all three of these things are coming together. We are seeing students explore information, particular information, and the way that they are exploring that information through a technology tool will best help my students understand. For example, something I haven't already pointed out is that my students will be creating a project and they will be researching a celestial body that they choose. And I've asked them to use or to create a thing link. A lot of times I give my students a choice. I have a digital product menu board and I allow them to choose But for this purpose, and because students are going to be looking at each other's, I thought it would be best if they all use the same tool, especially because sometimes I feel like the tool gets in the way of learning, and sometimes students go down a rabbit trail of the tool itself instead of going down the rabbit trail of learning. So once the students have completed their thing link, they are going to be looking at two other student projects, and they will use an online matrix to compare and contrast them. So here's the Venn diagram that I've created on a Google Doc. It's obviously not a standard looking Venn diagram, but I like to use something like this, something like a matrix, because I think, for one, it allows students to write more, and two, I think that visually it's a little bit easier to read. So the students are going to look at the different thing links from from two other students, and then they'll be writing the alike things here, and then they'll be writing the differences here for the two objects. When they are done and they have looked at the two other projects and they've completed the compare and contrast matrix, they are going to be going to Flipgrid, which is a really great tool, a great online tool, and they will be giving verbal feedback using a video. So I have prepared different reflection questions for them to use, and when they go to the recap link, they are just going to type in this code, and they'll be given different questions like, what would you change now that you've looked at others? What were some obstacles that you came in contact to? So by using these different instructional methods, and I'll get to how the instructional methods and the classroom behaviors fit into my project as well, the students will be able to use technology, they'll be learning content, and I think that it will also help them with learning the material best through the pedagogy that was used in the instructional tools. So the next part we are going to look at is Schulman's 6 observable classroom behaviors, which we can see right here. So comprehension for understanding, transformation, instruction, evaluation, reflection, and new comprehension. So I'll be going through each of these and providing examples from my lessons. So the first one, comprehension for understanding. This is basically what the students are going to learn. And so best practices look like reviewing what the kids know, writing goals from what they know and going over them with the students. And that will lead to identifying new goals based on what the students have learned. So what does this look like in my lesson? So I have learning targets or learning goals that I have used based on the standards, the NGSS standards. My students are also given a pretest for before we even start our space unit. So I will be looking over this, but the objectives that you can see kind of give me a baseline from where to start. Each day we will have a learning goal. It might be the same as the day before or a different one, and we will be reviewing that every day at the beginning of class. At the end of class, students will be reflecting and getting feedback, and I'll talk more about that later, and that will lead me to know, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that will help me know what the kids know and how I can adjust my instruction. So the second observable classroom behavior is transformation, and this is basically how students learn. So the best practices are students can easily make connections with the content, and we're using examples and quote real world connections. So one way I'm doing this in my lesson is that in their project, they have to relate where their object is to where Earth is, and they also have to show how gravity affects their objects. Students are also creating their own questions in their research projects. So they have a personal connection of something that they want to know, that they're curious about. Also, students may not see a direct connection between their project and their daily life, but they are analyzing and considering the world and the universe around them. And I believe this has deep connections to, quote, the real world. I think it creates curious students, which is what I want. I want to create curious students. So I think having them look outside of their world and the things that they experience, and to hopefully give them a spark of what is out there in the world and beyond our world, and what may be discovered and isn't even discovered yet. I believe those are connections and are allowing kids to think beyond. So the third observable classroom behavior is instruction. And this is basically how the information is presented. So we're looking at the contents and the objectives, and that is going to connect with the teaching strategies, or how the information is presented. So as I mentioned in the TPAC explanation, the content will direct me to the best teaching strategies. So in my lesson, like I have mentioned before, my students will have a graphic organizer that they are using for their key terms, and so that they can see the connections between the key terms and how they are related. And then they're also going to be using a compare and contrast matrix as well. So this is the content driving me to use these different teaching strategies and these graphic and advanced organizers. So the fourth observable classroom behavior is evaluation, and this is basically what the students have learned. Sorry, I went forward too quickly. So again, I'm going to be going back to my learning goals. I'm going to be evaluating with tools like Edpuzzle, where I can embed questions within a video. Students are getting immediate feedback, and I will be able to track their learning as well. Students will be getting exit tickets, like ones that are going to be on a Google form, and also through one-on-one conversations throughout the lesson. So these are not just things I'm doing at the end, or things that I'm looking at and not really going back to. These are things that I am doing throughout this lesson, which this hyperdoc, I would probably give my students probably between 7 and 10 days to complete everything. Some of these things are definitely more teacher guided, and some of them are definitely more student driven, very open-ended, very much using their own time. So the fifth observable classroom behavior is a reflection. This is basically, what do students need to know that they didn't get, and how can I as the teacher help them? So throughout the lesson and the activity ongoing, I am reviewing and I'm thinking about my strategies so that adjustments can be made along the way so that all my students can learn. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some ways that I can make adjustments throughout the lesson based on what I'm seeing. So possibly, a student, again, like I mentioned earlier, a student may get tripped up over the tool that is being used in order for them to analyze the information. So the very first bullet point you see under engage, it says students can write words or draw pictures on paper. So on the hyperdoc, I asked my students to use Google Drawings in order to do this, but for some students, overcoming and learning a new instructional or new technology tool is too much. And so it is totally fine for them to write the words or draw the pictures on paper. They can even take a screenshot of that or a picture of it and post it and link it to their HyperDoc. So that's something that's totally fine. Again, I don't want the technology tool to get in the way of learning. Learning must come first. And finally, we have new comprehension. And this is kind of the last three or the last two things that are leading us to the new comprehension. So we're going to have the evaluation, what they've learned, the reflection, what do they need to know that they didn't get, and that's going to give me and them new understanding. So it's going to help me know what teaching strategies do I need to adjust and what knowledge am I going to gain from seeing where the students are and what knowledge are they going to gain from seeing where they are. Now this might come up in misconceptions, it might come up in myths, it might just come up in them not understanding how to analyze and read a rubric and apply that to their actual product. So another way that I'm going to do this is by having students reflect on their learning, reflect on their project at the end, and they will be using this on recap. So students will be doing they'll be using their webcam to talk about the question. And there's 4 questions. One of them you can see. What problems did you encounter while you were working on your project? How did you solve them? Now, I know this is something that's being done at the end. There are other ways that I'm going to be learning about misconceptions through the feedback that I'll be getting on the exit tickets and the conversations. But I wanted to talk about this as my example because it's really going to help me know how I can help students in the future with choosing instructional strategies and how they learn best. So I think it'll give the kids really good information on themselves for thinking about what were some things that they learned throughout the process. And I think that's just as important as the content is. So the next thing that we learned about in this course is Marzano's 9 high-yield instructional strategies. And you can see those up on the screen. I'm not going to read those, but as I go through each one, I will talk about them individually. So the first one is identifying similarities and differences. So this can be something that is used with graphic organizers, metaphors, and analogies. In my lesson, as I've mentioned already before, I have a graphic organizer that allows students to see the connections between each of the key terms, as well as a compare-contrast matrix that they are going to use to compare and contrast two different objects from two different projects. So Marzano talks a lot about identifying similarities and differences in his book, The Art and Science of Teaching. And he refers to several reports in which the authors state that finding similarities and differences is something that comes very naturally to humans. This is something that we do on a regular basis. It also has a very high average effect size. So this is something that is pretty easy to implement, and the gains that you get from implementing this are huge. Some of the ways that he says that you can have students identify similarities and differences are with sentence stems, asking students to describe how something and something are similar because they both blank, how they are different because blank is, but blank is this. And so giving students those sentence stems, even though it might be something that to us as teachers or as adults seems pretty obvious, helping students with the language helps them really kind of get past a barrier to helping them see really what are the differences. He also says that classifying information can also be helpful, grouping things into categories that are alike and different. Using mind maps, using comparison matrices like the one that I have, having students create analogy examples. So these are some of the things that he talks about in the art and science of teaching that are helpful for identifying similarities and differences. So the next strategy is summarizing and note-taking. And so giving students a structure in which to take notes is very helpful, and also to have them summarize at the end is very helpful. So one thing that I had mentioned previously were Cornell notes, which is something that I use a lot of in my class. And so one thing that I did was I added an additional slide onto let me just go back, onto this graphic organizer. I added a slide in which I'm going to ask students to write a few sentences explaining how the terms are connected. So putting these words together and having them write a sentence will really help me understand if they are understanding the connections between the two. Also, being able to write a summary and putting things into a concise package really helps me see as the teacher if they understand it. Another way that I have used summarizing in my class is asking students to tweet or to write a text message. Those are some ways that require students to keep their responses short and concise. So reinforcing effort and giving recognition is the next strategy. So in Marzano's book, The Art and Science of Teaching, Marzano says that reinforcing effort means that students see a direct link between how hard they try at a particular task and the success of that task. He goes on to say that formative assessments aid this dynamic in that students can observe the increase in their learning over time. So by giving my students maybe a goal sheet or a checklist, or perhaps having them come up with their own goals or checklist for the hyperdoc or for their project, can really be helpful in having them see their effort and having them see what they've been able to accomplish, and for all of us to celebrate those goals. Several years ago, I went to a workshop that was titled Don't Tell Kids They're Smart. And I thought it was very interesting because the speaker talked about this very thing, that in our culture, we praise kids for being smart, but really they have either a really good general knowledge about a certain subject, or they have a very high processing speed in which they can process information. And so what happens is when students encounter something difficult, they think they are dumb at that particular thing. For example, math. So some students things might be very easy to them, and then when they come to math, it might be difficult. And so they say they are dumb about math, or they're not good at math. And what we really need to be doing as educators is reinforcing the effort and praising the effort and giving recognition based on that. Showing students, hey, you need to go back and look at your notes for that. Having them do those types of things, having them try hard, those are the skills we want our students to have. And unfortunately, a lot of students get praised because things come easy to them and they don't have to try very hard. And this leads to kids not having a lot of resilience and kind of giving up really easily. So the next strategy is homework and practice. So homework and practice extends the learning. It also should allow for differentiation. And we shouldn't do homework just for the sake of homework. Now, I did my master's thesis about homework, and personally, I rarely assign homework. Typically, it's usually, hey, I need you to finish something that you were working on in class. However, there are a lot of technology tools that allow for good quality homework. So using something like quizzes, it's similar to Kahoot, and I can create a question set and I can assign it as homework with Google Classroom. And also with Google Classroom, I can differentiate. So I can assign one quizzes question set to one group of students and another one to a separate group of students using Google Classroom. And the kids will get immediate feedback, which is very important. And I can also track the students' learning and maybe visit with them the next day about what where they are with their learning. So I would give my students a quizzes based on the key terms within the lesson that I'm using. So the next strategy is non-linguistic representation. And so this really helps students make connections. I also think that it is a great way, a great formative assessment, a great way for me to see what's inside the kids' heads. And I have used this as note-taking and summarizing. I also implement interactive student notebooks in my class. And one of the pieces of that is having students draw, even writing acrostics, creating postcards, doing a lot of output where they have been analyzing information and then they have to give it back to me in a different way and not just through writing. So in my example, the students are priming their learning through creating through Google Drawing, through a Google Drawing at the very beginning, talking about what they already know about space. And then in their project, they're asked to create original drawings and diagrams to show their learning in their project. So the next instructional strategy is cooperative learning. So this can be used to differentiate and scaffold information. You can combine a weak student with a strong student or put kids in small groups. It's probably best not to have groups bigger than 3, I have found, because once you get to 4 and beyond, there really isn't enough work for everybody to do. And to not always use projects as an opportunity to do cooperative learning. I have found that group projects you really don't get what you're wanting. I think it's often better to assign separate tasks and then students can come together and bring their separate components together. And I also think it's important to teach students how to work in a group. So using what's called accountable talk and giving students stems in which to use while they are working with someone else, I think is very, very important. I would even suggest that teachers do projects that aren't necessarily even content driven, just so they can teach kids how to work in groups, because kids do not know, and a lot of adults don't know how to work in groups. And so I think it's very important that we teach them. So moving on to the next one is setting objectives and giving feedback. So this goes back to something I talked about earlier, where as a teacher, I'm writing the objective on the board. We're discussing it. We're going over it. We're talking about what the goal is for the day. And then I'm collecting data throughout the lesson. Either my students are using dry erase boards to give me feedback. Maybe it's thumbs up, thumbs down. Maybe I am having them do a Kahoot or the quizzes that I had mentioned, or a Socrative quiz to give me feedback. Maybe I'm going around and just having one-on-one conversations. And so that I'm giving the kids feedback, they are getting feedback themselves, and from that I can differentiate the information. So what I have done in my lesson, as I've talked about before, is I have some of my I can statements or my learning goals. And then again, I can use Google Google Forms. I can have conversations with my kids along with some of the other examples I talked about. So the next strategy is generating and testing hypotheses. So this is kind of really straightforward. It doesn't always have to be in a quote scientifical way. Even though I teach science, this is not something that I would use only when my students are doing an experiment. I think this is something that needs to be done constantly, pretty much almost every day, at least within every week. You need to have kids thinking. And I always tell my students that they do this all the time, especially in middle school. I say, girls, you probably think, well, if I wear this outfit, then this boy will notice me. Or if I do this action, then I think this other thing is going to happen. So having hypotheses is not something that we don't do. We do rarely. It is something that we do all the time. So using prompts that require predictions, presenting a hook, and ask how the information will lead to other things or how it's connected before teaching is a way to do this. So I can ask my students what they think a word means. So for example, the word satellite, a lot of students don't know that the moon is a satellite of the earth. So it's not something that's just man-made that we put into space to have our cell phones work. And then asking students how these terms are connected, maybe even before my kids look at the key terms, having them look at things and maybe they could see that, well, the sun, moon, and stars kind of go together, asteroids and comets kind of go together, and solar system and galaxies kind of go together. So kind of priming the brain for what they're going to be learning is the idea behind generating and testing hypotheses. Now, the last thing is questions, cues, and advanced organizers. So with this, we will be seeing things like using stems, question stems, sentence stems, using wait time. I am very, very big on wait time in the classroom. I explain to my students that blurting out, that they shouldn't do that, not just because it's rude or they just shouldn't do that. I tell them that when they blurt out, they stop other kids from thinking, and that is not fair to those kids. And so I really try to ingrain that in my students, and it really, really does help. And using motions. I watched a video by Doug Fisher last year, and he talked about when we teach, we use a lot of cues that we're pointing, we're making gestures, we ask a lot of questions. But then when students have questions, we usually go straight to direct instruction and then just giving the kids the instruction. And what we really should do is we should start with questions, starting with stems, help to prompt the kids to the information that they are looking for, then use cues, and then finally go into direct instruction. And using advanced organizers like flowcharts, mind maps, and KWL charts also help with this. So I have shown you the KWL chart that my kids are going to be using on the Padlet. So they're going to start by talking about what's something that you learn and what's something that you want to know. The K part is kind of going to be involved in the Google drawing and when they show me what they know based on the word space. So now I'm going to be talking about subcompetency 2. So that is evaluating and exploring how the Schulman and Marzano frameworks relate to the TPAC framework. So I'm just going to be going through some different combinations of the observable classroom behaviors with the TPAC framework, along with Marzano's 9 high-yield instructional strategies, and I'll be providing examples how each of these relate to my class. So the first one we're going to look at is looking at Schulman's instruction, which is basically how information is presented to students. And I see that connecting with the pedagogical content knowledge. And I see this also connecting with all 9 or any of the 9 Marzano strategies. So what does this look like in my classroom? So when I'm teaching the key terms, so let's say with my space unit, like celestial body, satellite, galaxy, asteroid. So I'm going to let that content drive what strategy I'm going to be using and vice versa. So I'm thinking, okay, my kids need to be learning key terms. So what strategy am I going to be using? And some specific ones that come to mind are non-linguistic representation. So have students drawing pictures for each one, using advanced organizers like the one that I have already shown, where my kids will click and drag the words, see how they're connected, similarities and differences, having them take notes and summarizing. I also have them summarize after they do the click and drag graphic organizer. So the next combination I saw was the comprehension for understanding. That could connect with the TPK, with the technological pedagogical knowledge. And honestly, I could see the TPAC model being inserted into any of these combinations, which I will demonstrate later. And I could see this connecting to the setting objectives and giving feedback. So what does this look like? So in a future unit, or further in the space unit, my kids will be learning about seasons. So giving them a pre-test on seasons, I could be using the technology tool Socrative, because it's really easy. The data is really easy to read as a teacher. It will also grade open response questions, which is really great because things like Google Forms doesn't do that. It'll also give kids feedback if that's something I would want them to have in the beginning. I could also use the pretest again later on to help them see how they have improved on their knowledge. And then getting the information, so getting the information from the pretest on the Socrative will allow me to give students feedback through the app. It's also going to give me feedback through the app, or through the spreadsheet that the app will give me, and that will lead me to differentiate my instruction, or will guide my instruction. So if my students think that the seasons in the northern hemisphere are the same, occur at the same time as the ones in the southern hemisphere, so that's some information that is going to guide my instruction. If I see that there's only a handful of kids that think that, then that's going to allow me to differentiate with just those students. So with Schulman's 6 observable classroom behaviors, when I look at evaluation, reflection, and new information or new comprehension, I really see these as a continuum, starting with evaluation. So looking at what have the students learned, then to reflection, what do they need to know that they didn't, and then having that go on next to the new information. So creating new understandings, looking at the additional teaching strategies that I can implement, and knowledge that I get and that the students get because of the evaluation and the feedback. So here I really could combine all 3: technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge. Content knowledge coming from, well, when I evaluate, and then I reflect, I'm going to be able, as the teacher, as being the expert in the content, to know where to fill in the gaps. Pedagogical, because I'll know what strategies to use, and then technological, because I will know what technology tools that I can use to help enhance that information. So let's look at talking about the lesson that I've already referred to, that my students need to understand the sizes of celestial bodies. They really have a hard time with that. So I could use something like quizzes where I've talked about before. So I can assign this for my kids. They're getting immediate feedback. I'm getting feedback, and that can help give me new information. And that's going to allow me to set new objectives. So I'm getting that information. I'm giving feedback through the app. They're getting feedback through the app, and that will allow me to differentiate. So really similar to the last example, but kind of taking it a step further. Okay, so looking at transformation. So transformation is how the students learn. Again, I can see technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge all coming together and using cooperative learning as the Marzano strategy. So in my content, my students need to know the parts of a cell and what each part does. They also need to know why the structure of the cell, of that part of the cell, helps with its function. So for example, why the vacuole, why is it big in a plant cell? What they need to understand what the vacuole does and why its size helps do what it's supposed to do. So I could have my students create a mind map in Google Drawing. And we could use cooperative learning. They could either work together to make those connections, or they could teach each other to make the connections that they have made. Now, within the Google Drawing mind map, I'm also talking about identifying similarities and differences, using advanced organizers, perhaps even non-linguistic representation, lots and lots of different things. I could be reinforcing effort and providing recognition. I could have them write a summary after they have talked in their groups about this. So there's probably endless combinations between all of these three, but as you can see, I'm just focusing on a few. So next, comprehension for understanding. We're connecting that to pedagogical content knowledge and generating and testing hypotheses. So again, I'm having my kids take a pretest. And let's say I'm having them take a pretest by using sticky notes. And then I'm going to post those on a piece of chart paper for us to refer back to. And maybe my pretest is having students make predictions about what the key terms mean and their connections. So I could put all the words up on the board and have my students write on their sticky notes what they think the words mean, maybe have them pick two, and what connections they see between, let's say, two terms. And so I can get a really good idea from looking at their sticky notes where the kids are, what they need to know, and then we can always go back to those to help my students make the connections that they have predicted. And so the last one I'm going to look at is evaluation, PCK, and non-linguistic representation. So with evaluation, it's a formative assessment. It can be a summative assessment, but typically it's a formative. Let's say I'm having my students use sketch notes, and their sketch note images and icons are going to be informing me what the students know and how I can help address misconceptions and myths. This is something that I really like to do. I feel like with their drawings, sometimes I can get a better understanding with drawings than with words. For sub-competency 3, which states update a lesson plan using one of the frameworks as a model, I believe that my HyperDoc fulfills all of the requirements for this sub-competency. I have been able to address all three of the frameworks in this lesson plan, and as I developed this lesson plan and work through this Touchstone, I have gone back and added components like homework and practice, for example. For sub-competency 4, to reflect on the experience of planning for enriched classroom instruction, I have sought out numerous teacher colleagues, but due to this being summer, I was unable to get anyone to be able to reflect on my lesson. So I was going to reflect on my lesson. I believe, again, that this hyperdoc speaks to the requirements of the Touchstone. And my school uses the art and science of teaching as the model for our teacher evaluation program. So our school is always looking for the 9 high yield strategies in our lessons and in our teaching. As I bring this lesson to my students in the fall, I know that I'll have to make some revisions to it along the way. Some of those things could be having to extend time, having to go back and reteach some of the components, maybe having to go deeper with some of the information that I thought I might have had to in the first place. I probably will have to give very specific details on how to use ThingLink and talk to my students about analyzing a rubric. And so I look forward to using this lesson with my students. I think it will be a rich learning experience for them and a learning experience for me.